Right now, somewhere in your kitchen, there is a spice that most people walk past every single day without a second thought. It costs less than a cup of coffee. It has been sitting in homes across the world for thousands of years, and it has been studied in peer-reviewed clinical trials for its effects on the exact biological processes that determine whether your arteries stay open and flexible or narrow and harden into the high-pressure channels that precede the cardiovascular events most people fear most. What is startling is not that this spice exists. What is startling is how specific the research is, how clear the mechanism is, and how few people over 60 are using it in the precise way that makes the difference between flavoring a recipe and genuinely protecting an artery. The gap between those two uses is not mysterious. It is a matter of knowing 3 specific things about how to prepare and consume it. And by the time this video ends, you will know all 3. But before we get there, you need to understand what is actually happening inside the arteries of people over 60, because without that foundation, the rest of the story does not carry its full weight. The popular image of arterial blockage is a pipe slowly filling with fat, like a drain clogging with grease. That image is not only incomplete, it actively prevents people from understanding the real process, which is an inflammatory one, a living biological event happening inside the wall of the artery itself, driven by specific molecular pathways that respond directly to specific biochemical inputs, including the one in that spice in your kitchen. This is Dr. Victor Lang, and this channel exists for exactly this kind of conversation, the one where the mechanism is explained clearly enough to make the solution make sense. If this is where you want to come for real health science, hit like and subscribe right now. What follows is going to change how you think about a spice you already own. The actual process of arterial narrowing and hardening begins with the endothelium, the incredibly thin single layer of cells that lines the inner surface of every blood vessel in your body. When the endothelium is healthy, it is a dynamic, actively functioning tissue. It produces nitric oxide, the signal that tells the arterial walls to relax and open. It repels platelets and prevents clots from forming unnecessarily. It acts as a selective barrier and a regulatory surface that keeps the complex chemistry of the bloodstream separated from the structural layers of the artery beneath it. When the endothelium functions well, arteries stay flexible, blood flows freely, and blood pressure stays in a healthy range. But when the endothelium is damaged by chronic inflammation, by oxidized LDL cholesterol, by elevated blood sugar, by the cumulative oxidative stress that builds over decades, everything changes. Damaged endothelial cells release distress signals that recruit immune cells to the area. LDL cholesterol particles that have been chemically altered by oxidation burrow into the arterial wall and are engulfed by those immune cells, turning them into swollen, fat-laden structures called foam cells. Foam cells accumulate and form the core of arterial plaques. More immune cells are recruited. More inflammation is signaled. The plaque grows. The arterial wall thickens and stiffens. The channel through which blood flows narrows. And through all of this, the person feels nothing because the artery has no pain receptors in the way that skin and muscle do. The process is silent, structural, and progressive. Until it is not. Until a plaque ruptures, a clot forms on its surface, and the artery closes entirely in the event that most people know as a heart attack or stroke. The specific molecular engine driving this entire cascade is a protein complex called nuclear factor kappa B, or NFKB. This is the master switch that controls the expression of the inflammatory genes in the vascular wall. When NFKB is activated in endothelial cells and in the macrophages inside arterial plaques, it drives the production of everything that makes plaque grow, the adhesion molecules that recruit more immune cells, the inflammatory cytokines that sustain the process, the enzymes that oxidize LDL into its most damaging form. Chronically activating this switch, which is what the modern dietary and lifestyle environment does in most people over 50, is what accelerates the arterial aging process from the slow decline that biology expects into the faster, more dangerous trajectory that produces premature cardiovascular events. Now here is where the spice enters the story in a way that goes beyond the vague claim of being anti-inflammatory. The spice is turmeric, and its active compound, curcumin, is one of the most specifically studied natural inhibitors of NFKB in the scientific literature. Curcumin does not generally suppress immune function the way pharmaceutical anti-inflammatories do. It modulates this specific pathway in vascular tissue in a way that reduces the inflammatory gene expression that drives plaque formation without suppressing the acute inflammatory responses the immune system needs for infection and wound healing. This specificity is part of why its vascular effects appear in clinical trials in ways that broad anti-inflammatory approaches do not consistently produce. But here is the problem that most people never encounter when they start using turmeric. Curcumin, consumed in the way that most people consume turmeric, as a sprinkle over food or a pinch in a smoothie, is almost entirely wasted, not because the compound is inert, because it is metabolized and eliminated so rapidly by the intestinal wall and the liver that almost none of it reaches systemic circulation in concentrations high enough to affect the cells of the arterial wall. The pharmacokinetics of curcumin are deeply unfavorable for oral absorption, which is why most people who try turmeric supplements or start adding turmeric to their food notice very little. They are not imagining the absence of effect. The compound genuinely is not reaching the tissue that needs it in meaningful amounts, and this bioavailability problem is why the gap between common turmeric use and the specific preparation used in clinical trials is so consequential. The first key to unlocking curcumin's cardiovascular activity is piperine, the compound in black pepper that gives it its sharpness. Piperine directly inhibits the primary enzyme responsible for curcumin's rapid intestinal metabolism, effectively blocking the biochemical pathway that eliminates most of the curcumin before it can be absorbed. Research on this interaction has shown that consuming piperine alongside curcumin increases curcumin's bioavailability by approximately 2,000%. That is not a small margin of improvement. That is the difference between a trace amount reaching the bloodstream and a therapeutically meaningful concentration reaching it. The amount of piperine required to achieve this effect is not large. Roughly a quarter teaspoon of freshly ground black pepper consumed alongside the turmeric is sufficient, but it must be present. Turmeric without black pepper in the context of cardiovascular benefit is, for most people, almost entirely ineffective, regardless of the dose consumed. The second key is fat. Curcumin is fat-soluble, meaning it dissolves in fat rather than water, and is absorbed through the fat absorption pathway of the intestinal cells into the lymphatic system, and then into systemic circulation. When turmeric is consumed without any dietary fat, curcumin has no fat medium to dissolve into, and its absorption is dramatically reduced. When consumed alongside fat, whether that is olive oil, coconut milk, ghee, or any other dietary fat source, curcumin dissolves into the fat during digestion and is carried across the intestinal wall as part of the fat absorption process. This is why traditional preparations using turmeric almost universally combine it with fat-containing ingredients, a culinary wisdom that precedes the pharmacokinetics research by centuries. Consuming turmeric with fat alongside black pepper is the minimum effective preparation for cardiovascular purposes. The third key is consistency over time. The arterial changes that curcumin addresses did not develop over a week or a month. They developed over years of accumulated inflammatory stress, and the arterial restoration that consistently bioavailable curcumin supports is also a process that unfolds over weeks and months of regular exposure. Clinical trials showing meaningful improvements in endothelial function, arterial stiffness measurements, and inflammatory biomarkers in people consuming bioavailable curcumin preparations have consistently run for 8 to 12 weeks or longer. One-time or occasional use produces no measurable arterial benefit. Daily use in the correctly prepared form produces the outcomes in the research. This is the investment model, not a large cost, not a large time commitment, but a real commitment to consistency that transforms the preparation from a wellness experiment into a cardiovascular intervention. Let us go deeper into what the research shows happens in the artery when properly prepared curcumin is consumed consistently, because these specific findings are the part of the story that most people never encounter. In clinical trials measuring flow-mediated dilation, a standard technique for assessing endothelial function by measuring how well an artery dilates in response to increased blood flow, curcumin supplementation in bioavailable forms has produced improvements in older adults that researchers described as comparable to those produced by a regular aerobic exercise program. This comparison is remarkable enough to be worth sitting with for a moment. The endothelial improvement from daily bioavailable curcumin in people who did not change their exercise habits matched the endothelial improvement from regular exercise. This does not mean curcumin replaces exercise. It means that in the specific domain of endothelial nitric oxide production and arterial dilation capacity, curcumin is biologically active enough to move the same dial that exercise moves through the same mechanism of upregulating endothelial nitric oxide synthase. On the inflammatory side, clinical research has documented that bioavailable curcumin consumption significantly reduces circulating levels of C-reactive protein, a standard blood marker for systemic inflammation that is also one of the strongest independent predictors of cardiovascular event risk. It reduces interleukin-6, the inflammatory cytokine most directly linked to arterial wall inflammation and plaque destabilization, and it reduces the oxidation of LDL cholesterol, removing one of the primary triggers for macrophage foam cell formation inside the arterial wall. Together, these effects address the inflammatory cascade at multiple points simultaneously, which is why the clinical results are as strong as they are. Curcumin is not targeting one step in the plaque-building process. It is modulating the master regulatory switch that drives the entire cascade. The practical preparation that most reliably delivers all three bioavailability keys together is a golden milk preparation. Warm a cup of full-fat coconut milk, whole dairy milk, or oat milk that contains fat. Stir in 1 to 1.5 teaspoons of high-quality turmeric powder, which should be a deep, vibrant orange-yellow color, indicating freshness and curcumin concentration. Add 1/4 teaspoon of freshly ground black pepper. Stir in a small amount of additional fat if using a lower fat base. A teaspoon of coconut oil or ghee works well. A small amount of honey or a pinch of cinnamon rounds the flavor without adding significant sugar. Consumed once or twice daily, this preparation delivers curcumin in the fat and piperine context that maximizes its absorption and provides it to the cardiovascular system in the form the research supports. For people seeking stronger and more reliably dosed support, bioavailable curcumin supplements that use phospholipid complex delivery systems, nanoparticle formulations, or piperine-enhanced standardized extracts are available and have been used in the most impressive clinical trials. These supplements typically provide 500 to 1,500 milligrams of curcumin in forms that achieve dramatically higher plasma concentrations than standard curcumin extracts, used alongside the dietary preparation rather than as a replacement for it. They represent the highest end of the cardiovascular intervention that the research supports. One important consideration for people taking medications, particularly blood thinners like warfarin or antiplatelet drugs like aspirin or clopidogrel, is that curcumin has documented antiplatelet activity that may add to the effect of these medications. This is not a reason to avoid curcumin, but it is a reason to have a conversation with your prescribing physician before significantly increasing your curcumin intake if you are on these drugs. The interaction is real and manageable with awareness, but managing it requires the physician to know it is occurring. The arterial landscape of a 60 or 70-year-old body is not sealed. That is the truth that the research on curcumin, on nitric oxide, on endothelial function and inflammatory modulation keeps returning to from different angles. The endothelium regenerates. The inflammatory process inside arterial walls can be suppressed. Nitric oxide production can be restored. Arterial stiffness can be partially reversed. The biology of the aging artery is not a fixed downward trajectory. It is a dynamic system responding to inputs, and the right inputs can change the direction of the response. You have spent decades building the cardiovascular system you have today. The patterns of eating, the patterns of movement, the patterns of sleep and stress, all of it has been writing the story of your arterial health through the accumulation of small daily inputs. The spice that costs less than $3 and sits in your kitchen right now is one of those inputs. Prepared correctly, consumed consistently, it becomes part of a different accumulation. One that pushes the endothelium toward function rather than dysfunction. One that modulates the inflammatory switch that the plaque-building process depends on. One that the clinical evidence supports as genuinely, measurably, arteriologically meaningful. Now you know the three keys: the pepper, the fat, the consistency. What you do with that knowledge starting tonight is entirely in your hands. Tell me in the comments whether you have used turmeric before and whether you are combining it the way that makes it actually work. And tell me if you are going to change how you use it after watching this. Your experience matters to the people who will read this comment section looking for a sign that this is worth trying. And please share this video with someone in your life whose heart health you care about deeply, because the gap between the common version of this knowledge and the specific version you now have is the gap between a spice that does nothing and a daily investment that the biology of the artery can feel. The artery is waiting. Give it something worth responding to.